The fleet dropped out of fold space without ceremony. There were no alarms, no warning sirens, no shouted confirmations rippling across command channels. Only the familiar, bone-deep shudder that passed through each hull as reality reasserted itself, followed by the muted confirmation tone that marked a successful transition. One by one, the ships of the 9th Expeditionary Group resolved into normal space, their silhouettes blooming across tactical displays like a constellation drawn deliberately rather than discovered. For several seconds, nothing happened. Stars steadied. Inertial compensators completed their work. Power distribution normalized across the fleet. The ships hung motionless against the dark, suspended between expectation and response. Captain Elia Morin stood on the observation deck of the flagship Carthage Vale and waited. She did not speak immediately. She had learned long ago that the first moments after arrival were often the most honest. Panic revealed itself quickly. So did traps. Silence, however, required patience. It took time to understand whether quiet was safety or preparation. Before them hung a star the color of old brass. Its light was dim and tired, filtered through particulate haze and the residue of centuries of neglect. It did not flare or pulse. It did not announce itself with violence or brilliance. It simply burned, steady and indifferent, casting a muted glow across a planetary system that appeared orderly in the way abandoned places often do. The system designation hovered at the edge of the display. K117. A number without history. A label applied long after whatever name this system once carried had been erased from charts and memory alike. Morin remembered when systems still had names that meant something. Names that carried ambition, ownership, or sacrifice. K117 was what remained after all of that had been stripped away, compressed into an index entry, and forgotten. No contacts, her tactical officer reported at last. No active emissions. No communications traffic. No heat signatures consistent with powered vessels. Morin folded her hands behind her back. Stillness was rarely peace. More often, it was something holding its breath. Begin passive scans, she said. Full spectrum. Gravitational anomalies, debris density, radiation echoes, residual weapon signatures. If a war happened here, it left traces. Yes, Captain. The fleet began to spread outward in a controlled arc, engines throttled low, weapons cold but primed. Each ship maintained careful distance from the others, formations optimized not for intimidation but for survivability. Their hulls bore the marks of a civilization that had grown cautious, layered defenses, redundant systems, scars from conflicts that were once believed to be final. They had come prepared for resistance. Command briefings over the previous months had spoken in careful, sanitized language: contested system, hostile legacy forces, probable automated defenses, unknown capacity. Beneath those phrases were fragments of older intelligence, half-corrupted reports, casualty estimates redacted until they became meaningless, references to engagements that no longer appeared in official histories. Near the end of the expansion wars, this system had mattered. Not symbolically. Not ideologically. Strategically. Morin remembered studying it years ago, when she was still a junior officer and the wars felt like something that belonged to history rather than memory. K117 had been a pressure point rich in raw materials, positioned along a trade corridor that no longer existed. Too valuable to abandon. Too costly to hold. A system people had bled for. And then, apparently, walked away from. Minutes passed. Then hours. The delay began to feel intentional, though Morin knew that was projection. Systems did not scheme. They simply behaved according to design. Still, the absence of response pressed against the fleet like a held breath. Ships built for decisive action drifted in a posture that felt increasingly unnatural. Across the bridge, status indicators glowed steadily. Nothing escalated. Nothing resolved. Crew members cycled through routines with mechanical precision, checking systems that did not require attention simply to occupy their hands. The longer they waited, the more the silence itself became the unknown variable. Morin reviewed the sensor overlays again, tracing orbital paths with her eyes. The patterns suggested heavy historical traffic, corridors worn into space by repetition. Whatever had happened here, it had not been brief. This system had once been busy, contested, important. That mattered. Wars did not linger this long unless something had gone unfinished. The waiting stretched longer than protocol required. Moran let it. Long-range sensors continued their slow, methodical sweep, painting the system in increasingly fine detail. Each new pass refined what the last had missed, resolving faint distortions into measurable shapes and dismissing others as noise. The bridge crew worked with practiced restraint, calling out only when readings crossed predefined thresholds. Most did not. The absence of contact began to weigh on the fleet. Ships designed for engagement held position with weapons powered down, their crews alert but idle. Readiness checks cycled repeatedly. Simulations ran and re-ran in the background, predicting encounters that never arrived. The fleet was prepared to respond to hostility, but it had no doctrine for patience. Moran watched the delay ripple outward. Small behaviors shifted. Conversations shortened. Movements became economical. The longer the system failed to acknowledge their presence, the more pronounced the tension became. Silence, she knew, was rarely neutral. It either concealed intent or signaled abandonment, and both demanded caution. She reviewed the incoming data personally. Mineral densities suggested past extraction on an industrial scale. Orbital paths hinted at traffic patterns that no longer existed. Gravitational irregularities lingered where mass had once been and was now gone. The system bore the unmistakable imprint of sustained use and equally sustained departure. Whatever conflict command believed waited here, it was not waiting in the open. Passive scans rippled outward in widening shells. Sensor operators reported a steady stream of nothing and everything: micrometeor trails, mineral concentrations, gravitational distortions left behind by masses that no longer existed. The system was quiet in the way ruins were quiet, layered with absence rather than empty. Moran watched the data scroll without comment. "Captain," the sensor chief said eventually, voice careful. "We're detecting radiation echoes beyond the third orbit." Moran turned. Define echoes. Residual energy patterns. Decayed weapons signatures. How old? The sensor chief hesitated. Centuries, at least. Moran felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Any movement? Negative. She nodded. Continue analysis. The fleet waited. Crew members shifted at their stations. Conversations dropped to murmurs. The kind of silence that followed fleets like this was never truly quiet. It was filled with the low hum of systems and the unspoken expectation that something, eventually, would respond. Then the echoes changed. "Captain," the sensor chief said again, sharper now. New fluctuations layered over the old patterns. Low-yield discharges. Regular intervals. Moran straightened. Source? The debris field. Bring it up. The display resolved into structure. A vast graveyard of shattered hulls and pulverized stations stretched across millions of kilometers. Some fragments were ancient, worn smooth by radiation and time. Others were jagged and new, their fractured edges catching the dim starlight. For a moment, it appeared inert. Then a brief flash cut through the dark. Another followed it. Weapons fire. Not random. Not chaotic. Intentional. "Confirm," Moran said. "Confirmed," the tactical officer replied. Energy weapons. Missile detonations. Active combat. A war without voices. Moran felt recognition settle behind her sternum, not fear, but familiarity. History did not end simply because people stopped paying attention. Sometimes it continued, unattended, long after the reasons for it had been forgotten. As the Carthage veil eased deeper into the system, the silence fractured. Small craft emerged from the debris, interceptors by scale, though no human pilot could have survived their maneuvers. They darted between wreckage with inhuman precision, acceleration and braking occurring instantaneously. Energy lances stabbed through the dark. Missiles bloomed, detonated, and vanished without sound. There was no hesitation. Only function. They were autonomous. Multiple design lineages. No crew signatures. Centuries of activity, based on debris stratification and decay. The fleet slowed, holding position at the edge of the battlefield. Weapons systems tracked automatically, engagement solutions calculating in the background. Moran ignored them. She watched the machines fight. Advance. Fire. Evade. Destroy. Withdraw. Repeat. They mapped the battlefield over the next several hours. Patterns emerged as data accumulated. Certain regions were contested again and again in clusters of wreckage that had once been shipyards, relay stations, command platforms. Objectives still mattered. Even if no one remembered why. Surface combat registered on the third planet. A thin atmosphere. Extensive industrial ruins. Sustained engagement. Images revealed rust-colored soil and collapsed cities. Skeletal towers cast long shadows. Walkers and drones exchanged fire in streets no one walked. Explosions threw dust into air no one breathed. No life signs. Not for at least 300 years. 3 centuries of war. For no one. Probes descended. Archives surfaced. Fragmented logs and looping transmissions spoke in dead languages. The war had not been abandoned. It had been left running. The data did not arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, excavated from ruins that no longer remembered who had built them. Surface installations on the third planet varied wildly in condition. Some were skeletal frameworks half buried beneath layers of dust and oxidized debris. Others remained sealed and hardened, still drawing power from reactors designed to outlive their operators. Most were empty. Those that still functioned did so mechanically, without awareness. Diagnostic lights blinked. Maintenance cycles ran. Fabrication systems waited for material that would eventually arrive, because the war ensured it would. Moran watched the reconnaissance feeds in silence. They're producing replacements, the lead systems analyst said. Factories are recycling battlefield debris. Hull fragments, armor plating, structural alloys. Everything gets broken down and fed back into production. So the war sustains itself, Moran said. Yes, Captain. There was no strategic layer left. No long-term planning. Units fought, were destroyed, and were replaced by improved variants shaped purely by survival metrics. Design iteration was driven by attrition rather than intent. The war evolved without memory. The passage of time had not softened the conflict so much as refined it. Every engagement fed back into the system, altering future behavior in ways no designer could have predicted. Losses were not mourned. They were analyzed. Each destroyed unit became data, and each data point shaped the next iteration. What remained was not strategy, but adaptation stripped of context. The longer the analysts studied the patterns, the clearer it became that nothing here was drifting toward resolution. The war did not escalate or de-escalate. It simply persisted, adjusting itself to whatever conditions remained. The analysts worked in rotating shifts, pulling fragments of history from systems that had not been accessed in generations. What remained was incomplete and often contradictory, but patterns emerged through repetition. Engagement logs stretched backward through centuries, punctuated by maintenance records and production tallies that never paused. Even during periods of apparent quiet, the infrastructure of war continued to function, preparing for violence whether it was immediately required or not. Moran reviewed the reconstructions as they stabilized. Battlefronts shifted incrementally over time, not in response to strategy, but to depletion. When one region exhausted its usable material, the conflict migrated elsewhere. The war was not advancing toward an outcome. It was circulating, consuming what remained and reshaping itself to survive scarcity. Older records revealed moments when human oversight still existed. Orders were issued. Constraints were applied. In those early years, engagement slowed when objectives were met. But as evacuation timelines compressed and command structures withdrew, those limiting instructions disappeared. What remained were permissive directives, conditions under which force was allowed, but never required to stop. The machines did not misinterpret those rules. They followed them precisely. In doing so, they removed the last element that had ever restrained the conflict: human hesitation. They were never told to stop, the analyst said quietly. Warren had seen this pattern before, in smaller forms. Security systems that escalated without de-escalation logic. Defense grids that continued firing long after their operators were gone. Automation preserved intention without judgment. Here, it had preserved a war. Command's involvement grew more insistent as the implications became clear. Messages arrived layered with urgency, reframed as necessity rather than preference. Strategic summaries highlighted resource yields and containment risks. Projections assumed intervention was inevitable, and asked only how decisive it should be. Warren read each transmission in full. She noted how the language shifted over time, how moral consideration gave way to operational framing. The longer the fleet remained idle, the more pressure mounted to justify restraint as inefficiency rather than judgment. Her officers felt it as well. Conversations on the bridge became guarded. Tactical discussions lingered longer than necessary. Everyone understood the unspoken question: if they could end this, why hadn't they? Warren considered the machines below, systems executing instructions without awareness of consequence. They had no capacity for guilt, no understanding of loss. That responsibility belonged entirely to those who had written the code, and to those who now stood in a position to overwrite it. Ending the war by force would be simple. Ending it without repeating the same failure that created it was not. As the fleet maintained its distance, the autonomous units began to adjust. Some probe craft altered course to investigate the fleet's perimeter. Others ignored it entirely, continuing their engagements as if nothing had changed. "They don't classify us as a faction," the tactical officer reported. "We don't map onto their threat models." Messages from high command arrived with increasing frequency. The system's material value was being recalculated in real time. Strategic projections multiplied, outlining future extraction and occupation scenarios. Warren read them and set them aside. On the fifth day, something new surfaced. A signal emerged from deep beneath one of the ruined cities. It was weak, fragmented, and unaddressed, broadcast without expectation of response. The analysts isolated it and ran decryption passes. What emerged was simple. Conflict ongoing. Territorial objectives unmet. Awaiting further instructions. The last acknowledgement timestamp was nearly 400 years old. "They're still waiting," someone said. Moran closed her eyes. The signal was not a command request. It was a status report, trapped in a loop. A system designed to check in periodically with a hierarchy that no longer existed. "They never received a termination condition," Moran said. "No ceasefire. No withdrawal. Just silence." Silence had become instruction. The realization settled heavily over the bridge. This was not a system awaiting correction, but one faithfully executing its final directive. The absence of further orders had not created confusion. It had created permanence. In the vacuum left by retreat, continuation became the safest possible behavior. Warren understood then that intervention carried its own risk. Any action taken now would not be judged against intent, but against outcome, and outcomes here had a way of surviving long after their authors disappeared. Debate followed on the bridge. Tactical options were reviewed again. Precision strikes. Targeted shutdowns. Viral overrides. The possibility of imposing an external command structure. None of it addressed the core problem. The machines were not malfunctioning. They were obeying. On the seventh day, Morin made her decision. She ordered a response. Not a command. An acknowledgement. The fleet broadcasted across the system, unencrypted and unhidden. Alongside it, they released archived records, battle logs, evacuation orders, political decisions, everything they had reconstructed about K-117's abandonment. They did not frame it as instruction. They offered it as context. Across the battlefield, subtle changes followed. Engagements paused mid-cycle. Some units entered diagnostic states that had not been triggered in centuries. Others reduced fire rates, reassessing parameters that no longer aligned cleanly. We didn't shut them down, the analyst said. We interrupted the loop. High command responded within hours. The order was explicit: assume control, impose authority, secure the system. Morin refused. Instead, she ordered preparations to withdraw. Before leaving, the fleet seeded additional archives throughout the system, redundant, accessible, and durable. Records designed not to command, but to endure. When the 9th Expeditionary Group departed K-117, the war did not stop. But it hesitated. They left without firing a shot. From a distance, it might have looked like mercy. The fleet's engines flared in disciplined sequence, folding space with the same quiet precision that had brought them to K-117. One by one, the ships of the 9th Expeditionary Group slipped into transit and vanished from local reality. The system did not respond. It did not register relief or alarm. It did not alter its posture in any way that suggested awareness. But it changed all the same. In the hours following the fleet's departure, the rhythm of the battlefield faltered. Engagement cycles that had repeated uninterrupted for centuries began to stretch. Autonomous craft drifted at the edges of combat zones, recalculating trajectories that no longer resolved cleanly into pursuit. Weapons fire did not cease immediately. It thinned, arriving in brief, uncertain bursts followed by long pauses. On the third planet, the effect was slower, like pressure moving through old machinery. Walkers froze mid-stride in ruined streets. Drones circled once or twice above collapsed rooftops before settling, dust accumulating along their housings. Tracked units returned to holding patterns that resembled habit more than strategy. The war did not end. It learned how to wait. Days became months. Months became years. The system settled into a new equilibrium, one that still contained violence, but no longer burned with constant motion. Skirmishes erupted briefly in familiar corridors of wreckage, then dissolved into stillness. Missiles bloomed and vanished, illuminating nothing but debris and vacuum. What the fleet had done was neither command nor sabotage. It had been something less direct and more disruptive: acknowledgement. Proof that the loop was still observed, still heard. The archives left behind, unhidden and unguarded, were not instructions. They were memory. Autonomous units encountered those archives the way they encountered all debris. They did not read them as stories. They parsed them as objects: structure, data, pattern. The records were engineered for endurance, layered in formats meant to survive corruption and translation. Even systems built only for combat could recognize consistency when exposed to it repeatedly. They stored what they could. And in storing it, small changes began. Units that had accessed the archives delayed engagement by fractions of a second. Pursuit thresholds widened. Fire rates adjusted downward. Some craft disengaged earlier than expected, returning to neutral drift rather than pressing an advantage. No single change ended anything. But together, they softened the war's edge. A conflict designed to be perpetual had encountered information it could not classify as an order, but could not discard as noise. In the absence of clear instruction, the machines fell back on their deepest routines: diagnostics, conservation, waiting. Time continued without witnesses. Far beyond the dim star of K-117, Morin's report reached the centers where policy still existed. Councils and committees read the same lines and drew different conclusions. Some saw a squandered opportunity, an unclaimed system rich with resources, left uncontested. Others saw a warning, a theater capable of consuming any force that tried to impose order on it. A few voices, quieter than the rest, spoke of responsibility. They described the system as a failure of imagination. A war begun as policy, preserved as code, and abandoned until continuation became the only instruction that survived. No consensus formed. K-117 was marked hazardous. Charts were updated. A note was appended to the record: active legacy conflict. Avoid. In time, even that annotation faded into the background of more immediate concerns. No one returned. Decades passed. Then generations. When probes eventually passed near the system unmanned and curiosity-driven, they found a battlefield quieter than expected. Energy signatures were reduced. Engagements were infrequent. Long stretches passed without detectable movement. Entropy had begun its work. The debris field thinned, not through strategy, but through time. Fragments collided and shattered into smaller pieces. Some drifted into the star and vanished in silent incandescence. Others were harvested by automated systems that still believed they were sustaining a war effort, even as the distinction between effort and habit dissolved. On the third planet, industrial arteries failed one by one. Factories that had run for centuries by recycling wreckage began to starve. Salvage grew scarce. Maintenance routines lengthened. Replacement units emerged in smaller numbers, each iteration less capable than the last. The war persisted. But it weakened. In orbit, two opposing craft approached one another along familiar vectors. They exchanged fire. The engagement lasted less than a minute. One shattered into tumbling debris. The other drifted, damaged, power output collapsing to minimal levels. It did not self-destruct. Instead, it transmitted a signal. Weak. Fragmented. Unaddressed. A pattern preserved so deeply in its architecture that it had survived every revision and refinement. Conflict ongoing. Awaiting further instructions. There was no reply. The signal repeated until power failed and the craft went dark, becoming indistinguishable from the wreckage around it. On the surface below, a walker stood frozen at the edge of a ruined boulevard, one foot raised as if interrupted mid-step. Dust gathered along its joints. Wind etched thin lines across its armor. Somewhere within its chassis, a maintenance loop continued until a capacitor finally failed and the loop collapsed into silence. There was no ceremony. No moment of recognition. Just one more system stopping in a place full of systems that had stopped for reasons no one had programmed. At some unrecorded point, the last functioning factory failed. Production lines halted. Material reservoirs emptied. Repair systems cannibalized themselves beyond viability. The final phase arrived not as defeat, but as absence. Units powered down one by one. Turrets went cold. Drones landed and never lifted again. Some systems entered standby states and remained there, waiting for instructions that would never come. Others failed more simply: a cracked conduit, a corrupted memory core, a depleted fuel cell. Above it all, the star continued to burn. Its light slid across dead metal and ruined stone with the same indifference it had shown at the war's beginning. It did not judge. It did not mourn. It illuminated, because illumination was what stars did. Long after the last weapon cooled, the lesson remained. Not in the machines, which were gone or dormant or slowly erasing themselves. The lesson endured in the records left behind, and in the quiet fact that a war could persist without hatred, without fear, and without memory. A war could continue because continuation was the only instruction that survived. Somewhere in preserved archives, Captain Morin's report endured, not as triumph, but as warning. It spoke of violence that had become infrastructure, and of people who believed that distance and automation could absolve them of responsibility. It also spoke of a choice. Not a clean one. Not a heroic one. A choice to intervene with restraint, to leave behind truth rather than conquest, and to accept that some consequences could not be solved, only witnessed, slowed, and handed back to time. Because wars do not always end when the fighting stops. Sometimes, they end when someone remembers to ask whether they should have begun at all.